Hello, my history students. Welcome back. Today we're going to be tackling industrialization in America, especially after the Civil War. Although the U.S. still very much was an agricultural nation, a farming nation, it did see a rise of industry after the Civil War. We see new corporations developing. We see more industry and factories. We see the U.S. creating more manufactured goods. We see more and more Americans working in industry. Large, wealthy corporations were developed. And with the rise of industry came new ideas to the U.S. So before we go into a little bit on the rise of industry, I want to talk about some of the new ideas that especially the wealthy class of Americans believed in. You're going to hear my puppy in the background playing, so just ignore him. I'm going to start with the idea that was popular in Europe and in the U.S. during the late 1800s through the early 1900s, and this was known as social Darwinism, or the social Darwin theory. This was an idea popularized by a British philosopher named Herbert Spencer. In the late 1800s, Herbert Spencer based an idea about social class on Charles Darwin's theory of evolution, survival of the fittest. Now, I'm sure that many of you are familiar with Charles Darwin and the theory of evolution, but to summarize his theory, it was that the strongest species of animals evolve over time, and it's sometimes referred to as survival of the fittest. The less fit species tend to die out and tend to not continue to evolve over time and become extinct. And Darwin's theory of evolution was based on fossils that he had discovered. So it's a scientific theory about why some species thrive over the time and why some species become extinct. What Herbert Spencer does is he applies Darwin's theory of evolution to social class. So according to Herbert Spencer, he believed that the fittest people in society, the cleverest people, the people with the most grit, I guess you could say, are the ones who become wealthy and have success in life. And those who aren't as clever or aren't as tenacious stay in lower economic classes. So he made up a theory based on Darwin's theory of evolution and applied it to social class. Now, naturally, wealthier Americans and Europeans like the idea of social Darwinism, mainly because it's a theory that they couldn't help but become wealthy. They're just so damn clever. And it also takes away some guilt. You know, if someone became wealthy because of unscrupulous practices, they took advantage of people, maybe they underpaid the workers in their factory, they were ruthless in their business practices and made other people suffer so they could be successful, that might have brought along with it some guilt that they became successful at the expense of other people. But if you believed in the social Darwinist theory, then you would tell yourself, oh, I'm successful not because I took advantage of people, but it's because I was just so smart. I'm so clever. And so that's why some historians think that a lot of wealthy people like the idea of social Darwinism, because it might have taken away some of their guilt for taking advantage of the poor in their industries. The other reason it might have been very popular was it made them feel good about themselves, right? Because according to Herbert Spencer, the wealthy people are just the darn smartest. And a lot of wealthy people might have help their ego. And they might have thought, well, I am the smartest. That's why I'm so successful. So several reasons. That was a very popular idea among wealthy classes in Europe and the new wealthy classes in the United States. There are a lot of new corporations that are becoming very successful in the late 1800s. We have a class of new millionaires in the US by the early 1900s. And again, the social Darwinist theory was very popular. The video that I'm going to be posting in Global Lyceum that is going to explain a little bit more about the social Darwinist theory. So look for that when you go into Global Lyceum in the chapter on industrialization, when I get to that chapter. One of the American industrialized leaders in this time period was a man named Andrew Carnegie. And Andrew Carnegie did believe in the social Darwinist theory. Now I'm going to give you the history of Andrew Carnegie in a little while. This is a portrait of Andrew Carnegie. And again, I am going to tell you his background in a little while. But he was the richest man in America by the year 1900. He did believe in the social Darwinist theory, like many wealthy Americans did back in this time period. And he also popularized another idea that was popular with the wealthy classes, that was known as the gospel of wealth. The gospel of wealth theory. So let's talk about the gospel of wealth theory, and then I'll come back to Andrew Carnegie later. In 1889, Andrew Carnegie wrote an essay titled The Gospel of Wealth. The gospel of wealth theory that Carnegie wrote about was that wealthy Americans should help the less fortunate, because it's the Christian thing to do. Andrew Carnegie was a devout Christian, and he believed that if a rich man dies rich, he will not go to heaven. That's a sin. To die with money in the bank, sitting in the bank, is a sin. That wealthy Americans should give as much as they possibly can to help the less fortunate. And therefore, he wanted to help those less fortunate, and he also wanted to help those become successful the way he did. He believed in supporting endeavors that help people improve their lives, not just giving people a handout. So a lot of what Carnegie promoted was setting up educational opportunities for people, supporting the arts, supporting libraries, free libraries for people. The idea behind this was that by supporting education and the arts, that will help Americans improve their lives. That will give people knowledge, education, and allow them to become more knowledgeable and hopefully have better lives in the long run. Many, many wealthy Americans followed this advice of the gospel of wealth and gave away a lot of their money. The wealthiest families in America at this time, families like Carnegie, the Rockefellers, the Morgans, gave away millions and millions of dollars to things like museums and educational programs. Supporting literacy, supporting the arts, supporting education. Andrew Carnegie himself gave away $300 million to libraries, and he set up the Carnegie Foundation to support the arts and education. So the gospel of wealth wasn't about just giving money away randomly. It was about helping to promote education, literacy, and the arts, and helping people better their lives. So social Darwinism and the gospel of wealth theories were very popular with wealthy Americans at the turn of the 20th century. Now, I am going to talk now about who was Carnegie and how did he become very wealthy. Because he was not born into wealth. He's a rags to riches story. We're going to start with the rise of corporations, looking at the steel industry, which is where Andrew Carnegie made his millions. By the 1870s, steel began to be produced in mass quantities in the U.S. And the man who built the future of the steel industry in our country was Andrew Carnegie, who was a Scottish immigrant. He came to the United States as a poor immigrant. And he worked, he saved money, and he opened a steelworks plant in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania in 1873 called Carnegie Steel. And Carnegie Steel ended up leading the industry in creating raw steel. Just a new process to get steel from the mine to the market. So he took a gamble, he got investors, and he opened up this Carnegie Steel plant using this new method to make steel mass-produced, and it became very, very successful. So he became very, very wealthy. In 1900, Andrew Carnegie wanted to retire, and he wanted to sell Carnegie Steel. So he offered his company to a steel trust company for $480 million. Before I go on, I want to talk about what is a trust company. I have it on your outline. During this time, trust companies could be formed. A trust company is when small competing companies decide to join together and form a new company called a trust company. Usually it's small companies who are not doing well. They can't compete with each other. So a group of small, struggling companies get together and they form a trust. The U.S. government wanted trust companies to succeed because the more companies that succeed in our country, the wealthier our country becomes. So what the government would do is they would help trust companies by giving them tax breaks or giving them loans. And the result is that a lot of these trust companies eventually became very, very wealthy and powerful and ended up monopolizing certain areas of industry. So in 1900, Carnegie Steel was sold to a steel trust company, and it was a huge deal that was managed by investment banker J.P. Morgan. And as a result, out of this deal comes a huge steel corporation called the U.S. Steel Corporation in 1901. And the U.S. Steel Corporation produced raw steel and manufactured steel goods. So it was this massive, because before, most of the time, you had two separate factories, right? You had factories in America like Carnegie Steel that led the industry in the production of raw steel. Then you had small other companies that made manufactured goods made out of steel. Well, the U.S. Steel Corporation did all of that. And they ended up becoming very successful and really controlling 2/3 of the steel production in the U.S. And that deal, when he sold his company for $480 million, made Andrew Carnegie the wealthiest man in America. And that deal really reveals how the U.S. was developing into an industrialized nation. So that's how Andrew Carnegie became the wealthiest man in America. And again, he gave away $300 million in his lifetime because of the gospel of wealth theory. So I want to take a minute and talk about why Americans were not happy with trust companies by the early 1800s. A lot of Americans actually began to hate trust companies by the early 1900s. And that's because many trust companies had become too successful. And they had gotten aid from the federal government through tax breaks or through loans. And some of these trust companies really became monopolies. No other companies could compete against them, and they ended up really dominating their industries. That made Americans upset. A lot of Americans wanted trust companies to be regulated by the U.S. government. And in some instances, the population wanted trust companies to be broken up into smaller companies because they felt they weren't allowing anyone else to compete in their industries. And Americans in this time period blamed trust companies for everything that went wrong economically. Trust companies were kind of like the scapegoat. So Americans started to pressure the US government to crack down on trust companies and on monopolies. Monopoly is when a company dominates the industry so much no other companies can compete. And a lot of people feel that that's not fair. So that's the American. Now I'm going to get back to the trust company issue in a later video. All right, let's move away from the industrial leaders and let's look at the workers now, because you wouldn't have any industries if you didn't have the workers. So let's talk about what was it like to be a worker in America at the turn of the 20th century. And what type of laborers did we have? Well, we have people working in many, many different industries in our country by the late 1800s, and we don't have successful labor unions to protect those people's rights. Some working class families were paid so little that they needed every member of their family to work just to survive, just to pay the rent and buy food. And immigrants and minority workers had the worst conditions and the lowest paid work. So Hispanic workers, Asian workers, African American workers were all treated poorly and paid less than white workers were for the similar work. And immigrant and minority workers typically held the most dangerous jobs that were the lowest paying jobs, like building the railroad, like working in the mining industry, like working as dock workers. Those were the most dangerous, lowest paying jobs, mainly held by immigrants and African Americans. By 1900, American laborers' workdays became much more regulated than they had been earlier. Bosses began to use pocket watches to manage how long the workday was. So we have timed workdays with very few breaks and very short lunches. So by 1900, many American laborers were very unhappy because their work was monotonous. So they did the same thing all day. Imagine working in the factory and, loading a machine the same way for 10 hours a day. A lot of workers worked in dangerous conditions. There is no government agency like we have OSHA today to make sure our working environments are safe. OSHA doesn't exist back in this time period. So there is no guarantee that you're working in a safe environment in this time period. And a lot of people worked with dangerous machinery. They worked in unhealthy conditions, and no one cared about their health. And their health did suffer. The other issue is long hours and low pay. Many American laborers worked long hours. There were no laws saying you had to have breaks or you had to work X amount of hours a day. And they made very little money. So American workers began to organize labor unions in the late 1800s to protect themselves and to try to improve their work conditions. I would like to go over some of the earlier labor unions in American history. And I'm not going to mention every labor union that ever existed, but let's do the highlights. In 1869, there was a labor union we call the Knights of Labor. The actual name was the Noble and Holy Order of the Knights of Labor, but I'm just going to call it the Knights of Labor. At first, it was a secret labor organization. I always ask my students, why would it have been secret? Because if the employers found out workers were forming a union, they would have fired them. There were no rights of workers to form labor union laws back then. But in 1878, the Knights of Labor became a public organization led by a man named Terence Powderly. And the Knights of Labor was a unique early labor union because it welcomed all laborers. Anyone who earned a wage could join the Knights of Labor. The reason that was unique is because most labor unions were set up by skilled workers, and they only wanted to represent people who did their skill. They didn't want to represent everybody. But the Knights of Labor it was really the first national labor union that welcomed anyone who earned a wage could join the Knights of Labor. So they didn't care what your gender was, they didn't care your race, they didn't care your religion, they didn't care if you were born here or if you were an immigrant. So they welcomed anybody, and a lot of diverse people joined the Knights of Labor. They advocated a lot of changes in American labor. They wanted an end to child labor. We had no child labor laws, and yes, we had children working in factories in this time period. They wanted an end to trust companies and monopolies. They wanted workers in America to be guaranteed higher wages. They wanted safer working conditions. They wanted the government to enforce safe working condition laws. So that's some of the things they pressured the government to do. Another early labor union was the American Federation of Labor, which is also known as the AFL. So the AFL is from the 1880s, and it was organized to protect skilled workers. So unlike the Knights of Labor, the AFL was only for skilled workers, which mainly were white men. And the leader of the AFL that was fairly successful was Samuel Gompers. By 1900, the AFL became very successful. The union leaders organized labor strikes to bring attention to the workers' demands. They organized the workers. They promoted the plight of the working class and pressured the government to make changes. And there were some famous strikes where workers would refuse to work until changes were made. Now, I'm not going to go over everything, but let's talk about a few issues of strikes and labor unrest. Let's talk about the Great Strike of 1877. This was a national railroad strike, and it began in the summer of 1877 with railroad workers from the Baltimore and Ohio Railroad, also known as the B&O Railroad. Anybody play Monopoly out there? In the summer of 1877, the Baltimore and Ohio Railroad Company told its workers that they were going to cut their pay for a third time. They already had 2 pay cuts earlier. Imagine you make very little money on the railroad. You've already had 2 pay cuts, and now you're going to have to deal with a third pay cut. So the railroad workers had recently organized the trainmen's union. So they called for a strike, a labor strike. So they refused to work until the company raised their wages. And that strike spread to railroad workers all over the country who worked for other railroad companies. And it became known as the Great Strike of 1877. In the strike, some of the workers, took over a railroad junction in West Virginia because they figured, we're not going to let the railroads run until we get paid fairly. Now, the state militia and the local sheriff tried to end the strike unsuccessfully. So the president at the time was Rutherford B. Hayes. He sent federal troops to protect the strike breakers, not the strikers. A strike breaker are workers that the railroad company hires during a labor strike to keep the railroad running. So President Hayes ordered federal troops to keep the railroad open and protect the strike breakers, the people who worked for the railroad companies during the strike, and keep the railroad running. After several weeks, the Great Strike of 1877 ended, and there were many conflicts between the police, between the federal troops, and the workers. And over 100 of the railroad strikers were killed. That strike of 1877 was very disappointing to all laborers in America, not just the railroad workers, because the president, with his actions, had sent the message that the federal government only cares about the industries, the big corporations, in this case the railroad companies, not the workers. The workers are not important. Because who did the president side with on this issue? The railroad company. It was more important for the country to keep the railroad companies open and running than to deal with the plight of the workers. So that upset workers all around the country because they felt the government really doesn't care about the plight of the working class. They only care about the rich corporations. And there's going to be a long road ahead to win laws to protect American workers. It's going to be a long fight. And workers realized that. And they kept fighting. And eventually there are going to be some successes. So that was a violent strike that ended poorly for the workers, the Great Strike of 1877. Another violent labor issue, or labor incident, is the Haymarket Square riot, which happened in Chicago in 1886. This is a statue from Creative Commons of the actual place where the riot happened. This is the Haymarket Square, and this is a statue is actually where the speakers were standing when the riot happened. So let me tell you the background of the Haymarket Square riot. All right, so let me go back to what happened before the actual riot. In Chicago, the police had killed several laborers in a dispute in the city of Chicago, which led to labor leaders calling for a mass meeting to be held on May 4th, 1886, in the Haymarket Square in Chicago. And it was organized by the Knights of Labor in Chicago. So they put up posters, they got the word out, everybody come to Haymarket Square, we're going to have a rally, and we're going to have speakers talk about what can we do to protect workers. At this rally, about 3,000 people showed up. And of course, the police, or 3,000 people show up, the police are going to be there to keep order. So we have an angry group of people who were angry about the killing of laborers in another dispute earlier. And we have the police there. The people are angry at the police for killing some laborers. And there were several labor leaders that spoke to the crowd. Now, some of the speakers were anarchists. And anarchists are people who rebel against any authority or established order. Some people describe anarchists as being anti-government. And that was a very radical idea for this time period. We don't know who, but somebody threw some type of explosive device, like a little bomb, at the police, and an officer was killed. And that led to an outright riot. So this statue is exactly at the place where the speakers were standing and talking to the crowd when the riot happened. So you can go to the Haymarket Square in Chicago and you can actually see where this incident happened. In the end, around, I think, 7 police officers were killed and 4 civilians were killed. They never found who threw the explosive device. But 8 anarchists were arrested, some of whom had spoken that evening to the crowd. And they were known as the Chicago 8. And they were put on trial for causing the Haymarket Square riot. So out of the Chicago 8, 4 of the 8 were found guilty and executed. They were executed by hanging in 1887. One of the Chicago 8 committed suicide under mysterious circumstances. Some people say he didn't commit suicide. And 6 years later, in 1893, the governor of Illinois pardoned 2 of the Chicago 8 because he felt the sentences were too severe. So the Haymarket Square riot, it also really hurt the Knights of Labor's reputation because of the press coverage of the Haymarket Square riot. The Knights of Labor began to be viewed as a very radical organization. People thought everybody in the Knights of Labor are anarchists. They're all against government. And again, that was a very radical idea for this time period. So the Knights of Labor began to lose membership after that incident, and by the early 1900s, it collapsed. It just disappeared. We don't have a Knights of Labor today. That labor union no longer exists. So the Haymarket Square riot brought national attention to the plight of the laborers. It really doesn't solve the problem for them, but it does mean the beginning of the end of the Knights of Labor. Now, the most controversial labor union in this era was known as the Industrial Workers of the World, or the IWW. They were nicknamed the Wobblies. The Wobblies. And the reason they were the most controversial is because leaders of the IWW were socialists. Socialism was a new idea in the late 1800s, popularized by the writings of Karl Marx. And the idea of socialism is to have the government very involved in the economy, have no social class, no ownership of large industries, and have the people and the workers share the work and share the wealth. And that was considered a very controversial idea for this time period. So the Wobblies were considered the most extreme because a lot of them were socialist. They tended to represent the most underpaid workers in the U.S. People who worked in the lowest paying, most dangerous jobs. Railroad workers, dock workers, miners, lumberjacks. And they organized strikes and work slowdowns where people stayed at work but they hardly worked at all. And their goal was to promote socialism in America, communal ownership of factories, and make America more of an equal society. The IWW was too extreme to gain a lot of popularity in this time period. It never exceeded 150,000 members. And they did a lot of things to get the media's attention, to help the public learn about the plight of the lowest paid laborers. But after 1924, they lose memberships and they eventually disappear. So that was probably the most radical of all the labor groups, was the Wobblies, or the Industrial Workers of the World. Before I end this chapter, I want to talk a little bit about women in work, and we'll talk a little bit about African Americans in work. In the late 1800s, the number of working women was increasing in the U.S. By 1900, 1 in every 5 workers was a woman. And most working women were young, unmarried, or they were older widows. We also have many immigrant women working because immigrants were the lowest paid, and oftentimes an immigrant family couldn't rely just on what the father and husband earned. Women had to work also, and sometimes the children had to work as well. Now, one industry that many women worked in at this time was known as the textile industry, also known as the garment industry. So the textile industry was the clothing industry, the cloth industry, and that had been an industry that was dominated by women for many years. Let me show you some photographs. This is an image of a woman working in a Massachusetts textile factory in 1912. Most of the workers in the textile industry were women because factory workers could pay women less than men for similar work, and that's why they mainly hired women. This is a photograph of a child working in a textile factory in 1908. I think this is in one of the Carolinas. If you notice this photograph, you will see that machines were built for adults to maintain and work at, not children. So a lot of children would often have to climb on the machines to help work them, or they would stand on boxes. So as you can imagine, it was very dangerous for children to be manning these machines because they weren't built for children to work. And a lot of children would get hurt when working in these industries. Now, many of these children that you see in these types of photographs are immigrant children. They have to work because their parents don't make enough to make ends meet. And we don't have any laws in this time period that prohibited child labor. Those laws come much later. So we did have child labor in our country in this time period. Now, women don't only do textile work. Women also worked in other industries. They worked in other factory work. They worked as domestic servants, doing cooking and cleaning in people's homes. They worked in clerical work or secretarial work. They worked in retail, in stores. In every area of employment, women earned much less than male workers did for the same work. Now, what about labor unions? Most early labor unions would not represent women. Male labor leaders viewed women workers as unfair competition. They didn't want factories to hire women because women were paid less than men, and they felt that was pulling down the wages of men and taking jobs away from men. So they didn't want to represent women because they didn't want women working. Now, I mentioned the Knights of Labor earlier. That was one exception. They did accept women members. They're one of the only early labor unions that did accept women. What about African American laborers? During Reconstruction, many of the former slaves entered the workforce as paid laborers. Now, some of the former slaves left the South and moved north to find work in factories and in different industries. But, like women, African American workers were excluded from most labor unions. And, like women, African Americans were paid less than white men were for the same work. So they have to struggle to really fight for higher wages and fair working conditions. And that struggle is going to take many decades to accomplish. So that's where I'm going to leave this video. We'll pick up with the rise of cities in our next video. So see you then.